Well, thanks very much. Gee, that's just like what my kids do when I get home. Okay, I'm Mike Behe. I've been told that I have 35 minutes to talk, and since I'm a professor, and it's usually enough for one sentence or so, let me start right away, start right into it. Okay, the talk is titled Purposeful Design at the Foundation of Life. That is, that we can see from what we've discovered that life was purposely made by a being who knew what he was doing. And this, as you might have heard, is really a rather controversial stance in academia, which is where I make my living. So I always start off by saying, I'm not officially speaking for my university. I'm not speaking for my colleagues. My mother disagrees with me. These are just my views here. And the talk that I'm going to give today kind of follows the outline of an op-ed piece that I wrote for the New York Times maybe a decade ago now. And the context was that there was this evolution teaching dust-up going on in Kansas. And the Times wanted somebody to explain what is design and what is the reasoning behind it for their readers. And so the point is that if you can explain it in an op-ed piece, it's not all that hard to grasp. So it's pretty straightforward. And the outline of my argument, I'm going to try to make 5 points today. The first point is going to be that design is not mystical. It's not something you have to close your eyes and raise your hands in order to grasp. Rather, it's deduced from the physical structure of a system. And the second point is that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. And when I say everyone, I mean even those people who most strongly oppose the conclusion that that appearance of design is real, that it truly points towards design. And the people who disagree that the appearance is true usually have some other explanation that they think is correct. And the most popular one in academia anyway is Darwin's theory of evolution. That is, life developed by a series of random changes plus natural selection. And so my third point is going to be that there are problems with that idea. There are structural obstacles. In other words, there's physical reasons to think that Darwin's mechanism cannot do what its fans think it can do. But if you read, modern papers, magazines, look at TV, whenever you see a science show or a popular science magazine, you'll often come across the claim that science has already shown that Darwin's theory can account for life as we know it. It's been demonstrated already. And so my fourth point is going to be that those grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination. Okay, not little Darwinian claims. It can explain a number of things pretty well, but the grand Darwinian claims that it explains the overall structure of life rest on imagination. And the fifth point then is going to be a summary point. It's going to be this, that right now, in the year 2014, we have in hand strong positive evidence for the purposeful design of life, and yet little to no evidence that Darwinism can do what's generally claimed for it. So let's start out and let's go through those points one by one. Start out with the first one, that design is not mystical. It's deduced from the physical structure of a system. And in order to do that, let's first ask ourselves, well, what do we mean by intelligent design? What is intelligent design? And if you look in a dictionary, you'll see a number of definitions, but the pertinent one is something like the following: that design is the purposeful or inventive arrangement of parts or details. And we can kind of shorten that, saying that design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. And that means that we deduce design, we inferred that design has happened whenever we see parts that appear to have been arranged to accomplish a function. Well, that's a bunch of words. It's oftentimes easier to grasp an idea if you can see an example. So let's look at the next slide here. Don't know if you can see it too well, but this is a Far Side cartoon. And let me try to point with a cursor here. In it, we see a troop of jungle explorers here, and the lead explorer here has been strung up and skewered. And this fellow here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Okay, words to live by. Now, let me assure you. Okay, whoops. So, let me go back. Everybody here looks at this cartoon and immediately realizes that this was designed. This was not an accident. His death was intended. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends upon you recognizing the design. It wouldn't be all that funny if you just fell over a cliff. So let's ask, how do you know that? How do you know that this was designed? Is it a religious conclusion? Probably not. I haven't been to this church before, but probably not. No, you know that this was designed because you see a number of different parts. You see the wooden sticks, the vine, purposely arranged to fulfill a function, the purposeful arrangement of parts. So that's the point, that we deduce design from the physical properties, the physical arrangement of parts. But there's one other point that I have to make about detecting design before we move on, and that's the following: that the strength of the design inference is quantitative. And by that I just mean that the more and more parts we have, and the more and more closely they are arranged to fulfill the function, then the more and more and more confident we can be in our conclusion of design. Now let's look at an example of that. Suppose you and a friend were walking outside and you came across these mountains, and your friend said, "How do you think those mountains got there?" And you would say, "Gee, I never did take that geology class. Plate tectonics, volcanic activity, I don't know." Well, most people would say, "Oh, that sounds reasonable. There's no reason to think of anything else." But suppose you and your friend continued your walk a long, long way away, and you came to New Hampshire, and you saw this mountain, and your friend asked you that same question: "Where do you think this mountain came from?" And now you would say, look at that. This is actually a structure called the Old Man of the Mountain, and there are state workers on it trying to stabilize it. It was unstable. It actually fell down a few years ago. But you would say, like many tourists did, that, hey, when you look at that, it looks like a face. There's a chin down at the bottom, and something that kind of looks like a nose in the middle, and a forehead towards the top. Do you think maybe some Paleolithic tribe might have gotten together and say, maybe, but it's probably just some strange arrangement of rocks. You look at it from a different direction, it doesn't look anything like a face. Most people would agree. But then you and your friend continue your walk, and you come to this mountain. And he asks the same question. Where do you think this mountain came from? And now you'd never say plate tectonics or volcanic activity, at least for the faces here. Anybody, even if you had never heard of Mount Rushmore before, anybody would conclude that these faces were purposely designed. They were put there by somebody who knew what he wanted to accomplish. And the reason we conclude that is because we see more and more parts that are arranged, shaped the right way, placed the right way, to fulfill the function of conveying those images, the presidents of the United States. So that's the point, that design is not mystical. We see it from the physical evidence, the purposeful arrangement of parts, and that the more and more evidence we have, the stronger and stronger our conclusion of design can be. Now let's focus on the second point, that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. And again, when I say everyone, I mean even those folks who most strongly oppose the conclusion that that design is real. And as an illustration, I'm going to look at the writings of a man named Richard Dawkins, who's been in the news over the past few years. And 25 years ago, Richard Dawkins, who's a professor of biology at Oxford University in England, wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker, which was a classic and strong defense of Darwin's theory of evolution. Nonetheless, if you can read the screen up here, and you can read the citation, page 1, on the very first page of the very first chapter of his strong defense of Darwin's theory, Dawkins wrote the following. He said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. That's the very definition of biology, according to Richard Dawkins. Well, okay. Now, Dawkins does not think that things in life were designed for a purpose. He defends Darwin's theory of evolution. So we can ask, why does he think they look that way? He doesn't think they were designed, but why does he think that they look like they were designed? Is it for some artistic reason that, flowers are so pretty? Or an aesthetic reason, like so baby seals are so cute? No, if you read Dawkins, it's not for aesthetic or other reasons. It's rather for engineering reasons. He writes a little further into the book that we may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose, such as flying, swimming, seeing. Any engineer can recognize an object that has been designed, even poorly designed, for a purpose, and he can usually work out what that purpose is just by looking at the structure of the object. Now, what's he saying? He's saying that we recognize design by the purposeful arrangement of parts. So even Richard Dawkins agrees that that is how we come to a conclusion of design. Well, okay, so things in life appear to be designed. Is it kind of like the old man of the mountain, though? Is it kind of interesting and a little bit intriguing, but it's marginal? Well, no, not according to Richard Dawkins. Dawkins says that the appearance of design in life is overpowering. He writes, Natural selection is the blind watchmaker because he believes in Darwin's theory. Blind because it does not see ahead, does not plan consequences, has no purpose. Yet, the living results of natural selection overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design, as if by a master watchmaker, impress us with the illusion of design and planning. So according to Richard Dawkins, we're not talking about Old Man of the Mountain. We're talking about Mount Rushmore and well beyond that, an overpowering appearance of design. Well, of course, Richard Dawkins and many other scientists do not think that this appearance is real. They think it's misleading. They think that the actual explanation for the appearance of design in life is Darwin's theory of evolution. That is, that random changes come up every now and again, and that if they help an organism survive, they can be selected by natural selection, and that builds the appearance of design. So, my next point then is that idea, Darwin's theory of evolution, has problems. There are structural obstacles. There are physical reasons to think that it cannot do what its proponents claim for it. And I explained that in my first book, Darwin's Black Box, about 18 years ago. And in it, I quoted a passage from Darwin's Origin of Species, one in which he was talking about very complex, what he called organs of extreme perfection, like the eyeball. And he thought he could describe an evolutionary pathway for that. But he did say then at the end, he said, well, what would be a problem for my theory? And Darwin said the following. He wrote that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, adding, but I can find out no such case. Darwin here is insisting that his theory was a gradual one, that evolution had to work in tiny steps over long periods of time. He knew that if systems or organisms improved in leaps suddenly, then it would look suspiciously as if something other than random changes were involved. So he always insisted on this gradual approach to evolution. Well, let's take Darwin at his word and ask ourselves, well, okay, what sort of an organ or what sort of a system cannot be formed by numerous successive slight modifications, can't be formed in this gradual manner that Darwin insisted on? And one which can't is one which I called irreducibly complex, or something that had the property of irreducible complexity. Now that's a fancy phrase, but it stands for a pretty simple idea. It just means you've got a machine or a system or something that has a number of different components. And all the components interact with each other to do something, to produce a function that the individual components can't. And again, that's some words that it's better oftentimes to see an example. And an example I like to show of such a thing from our everyday world is the following. And this is just a simple mechanical mousetrap, one you'd buy in a grocery store, say. And as you can see, a mousetrap has a number of different parts. It's got that tightly wound spring in the middle, and if you look closely, the top end there is extended so that it presses against the wooden platform. And at the other bottom end, another extension of the spring, the metal overlaps this other metal piece, which is called the hammer, and that's the piece that actually squashes the mouse. And when you push the hammer over, it's got to be stabilized in place until the mouse comes along. That's the job you see in the lower right there of the holding bar. And the holding bar inserts into something called the catch. in order to stabilize it. Now, the mousetrap needs all these parts to work. If you took away the spring, if you took away the catch or the holding bar or any of the parts, then you would not have a mousetrap that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to. You'd have a broken mousetrap. It wouldn't work at all. So this is what I mean by the phrase irreducibly complex. This is an example of it. Now, it turns out that things like this are big headaches for Darwin's theory, because if you wanted to evolve something like a mousetrap by something like Darwin's mechanism of numerous successive slight modifications, how would you do that? Where would you begin? Would you say, start with just the wooden platform and hope to catch mice, say, inefficiently? Maybe they'd trip over it as they ran across the floor or something. And then maybe you could improve it. Maybe you could put a kind of a thin piece of metal like what would be the holding bar onto it. And then maybe as they trip, they might impale themselves on the holding bar. No, that's silly. That wouldn't work. And that's the problem with irreducibly complex systems. You can't make them gradually. They only work pretty much when the whole thing's put together. So natural selection wouldn't have anything to select until the whole thing was put together. So that's a problem. Well, okay, mousetraps are interesting. I spend a lot of time thinking about them. But the real question we want to answer is, are there any irreducibly complex biological systems? And especially since modern science has shown that the kind of foundational level of life is the cellular and molecular level, are there any irreducibly complex cellular or biochemical systems? And the answer is that, yeah, they're all over the place. You can't turn a page of a biochemistry textbook without coming across examples. And my favorite example, makes a good visual example, is shown here. This is a drawing of something called the bacterial flagellum, taken from a popular biochemistry textbook that's used widely in the United States. And the flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. And just like an outboard motor in our everyday world, it turns a little propeller, and the propeller turns around and around and pushes against the water, and that pushes the bacterium forward. And that squiggly part on the right-hand side, that acts as the propeller, and it's literally turned around and around and around. And the propeller is attached to the drive shaft, which is that yellow rod there in the middle, by something called the hook region, which is the orange part, kind of a little above that. And the hook region acts as something called a universal joint, which engineers will know can transmit the motion of the drive shaft into a different plane that allows the propeller to spin. And the drive shaft is attached to the motor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell to power the turning, kind of like water flowing over a dam can turn a turbine. And the whole thing has to be kept stationary in the plane of the cell membrane, and that's the job of some of these parts on the bottom that act as a stator. And there's many other parts too, and all of these parts, which are drawn as little cartoon geometric figures, are actually themselves very complex pieces. I like to show people this drawing of the flagellum because most people, when they see it, quickly realize that this is a machine. This is not like a machine. It is not analogous to a machine. This is a real machine at the molecular level. And from what we know about machines, that can give you kind of a clue about what is required to make one. Well, maybe you can see from looking at it that, like a mousetrap, the flagellum is irreducibly complex. If you take away the drive shaft, if you take away the hook region, if you take away the propeller, the flagellum fails to work. And so it too is extremely difficult to explain in terms of Darwin's numerous successive slight modifications. And in fact, nobody in science has explained how that could come about. Well, you might ask, is this some kind of freak of nature? You know, is everything else relatively simple and then we see this? No, it turns out that things like this are everywhere you look at the cellular and molecular level of biology. Just as an example, here's the cover of an issue of Cell, which is a journal for professional biologists. And if you can see, the issue is entitled Macromolecular Machines. And if you look at the titles of the articles on the table of contents, you see things like the cell is a collection of protein machines, polymerases in the replosome, machines within machines, mechanical devices of the spliceosome, motors, clocks, springs, and things. Things like this are all over biology. So the point is that there are structural obstacles. There's physical reasons to think that Darwin's theory really can't do what its proponents claim for it. But again, you know, in our everyday life, we hear it claimed repeatedly in the media that Darwin's theory has been shown by science to be able to make everything in life. So the next point is to say that those grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination. Now, imagination is a good thing in science, as it is in many other enterprises, but if it's undisciplined, if it's too far removed from the data, then it can become misleading. And to advance this claim, I could have a number of quotes, but I'll rely on a man named Franklin Harold, who's an emeritus professor of microbiology at Colorado State University. And over a decade ago, he wrote a book called The Way of the Cell, which was published by Oxford University Press, a very prestigious academic publishing house. And in it, he considered the idea of intelligent design. And he had this to say about design. He wrote, "We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity." And he cited my book. And he continues, "But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Okay. Well, here he makes 2 points. Let's pause a minute to consider those 2 points, and I'm going to take them in reverse order. He says that there are no detailed accounts, only a variety of wishful speculations. Now, wishful speculations, this is more commonly called just so stories. You know, like the children's stories that Rudyard Kipling wrote over 100 years ago. I'm sure you've heard of them. You know, how the tiger got its stripes, you know, how the rhinoceros got its horn, how the bacterium got its flagellum. You know, all of those stories. You know, it's funny, but if you think about it a little longer, it's really astounding that so many scientists credit this theory that has been so fruitless at the foundational level of life, and makes you think that perhaps some other idea is called for. And the other point that Franklin Harold makes is he said that we should reject intelligent design as a matter of principle. What principle? What is the principle that makes us reject design? It seems pretty obvious. You look at the drawing of the flagellum, it's not hard to see. But apparently we're forbidden to entertain the idea of design. And why is that? Well, actually, he never states the principle. He just writes what I showed you and then goes on to write about other things in his book. Nonetheless, I think what he had in mind is this, shown on the next slide here. And that is that intelligent design seems to point strongly beyond nature. It seems to have philosophical, maybe even theological implications. And that makes some people nervous. And they think that we should avoid ideas that seem to have such strong extra scientific implications. Well, I understand what they're thinking, but I disagree with them. When I was being trained as a scientist, we were always told that science follows the evidence wherever it leads. Let other people worry about the philosophical implications. And I thought that was good advice then, and I continue to think that's good advice. Okay, then our bottom line, final point is this, that right now we have strong evidence for design, but just little evidence at best for Darwinism. And we've just gone through why there is not the evidence that one is led to believe for Darwinism. But you might say to yourself, remind me again, what is that evidence, strong positive evidence for design? And it is just what Richard Dawkins said it is, that life overwhelmingly impresses us with the appearance of design, as if by a master watchmaker. And that is how we detect design. That is how we come to a conclusion of design, by a strong, purposeful arrangement of parts. Now you might say to yourself, what sort of reasoning is that? Where you say, well, we see a purposeful arrangement of parts in some jungle trap, and we see a purposeful arrangement of parts, say, in a mouse trap, and now we see a purposeful arrangement of parts in life. And for all of them, we can conclude that it's the result of an intelligent design. What sort of logic is that? Well, the kind of logic is colloquially what we do in our everyday life. A good illustration of it is shown on the next slide here. What is that? Okay, yeah, I heard some people say, it's a duck, sure. Because if it looks like a duck, and if it walks like a duck, and if it quacks like a duck, then we are justified in concluding that that is a duck. You know, hey. And as I said, that's the colloquial argument for it. But philosophers know that this type of reasoning is one of the two major kinds of logical reasoning that we humans, we rational creatures, always use. And they actually have a special term for it. They call it an inductive argument. You see. I'll just, thank you. Okay, inductive arguments, philosophers, are we talking philosophy or science or what? Well, if you look up the term inductive reasoning, you'll see things like this from the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you look at the yellow sentence, this is the kind of logic normally used in the sciences. This is a scientific, this is an empirical argument. We see the physical evidence, the structures of life, and we reason as we do in our everyday life for mousetraps and so on. This is a normal scientific argument. And the conclusion then is simply that intelligent design is rationally justified. Okay? This is not some private revelation. This is not some mystical experience. This is a reasoned, physically based, empirical argument. Okay, well, as I said at the beginning, this is a controversial argument, and there's been a lot of criticisms going back and forth, criticisms made and answered, and I've set up a couple places where I respond to critics. They're the chief ones right there. And one place is my faculty website at Lehigh University. I have posted a number of my academic papers and book chapters and things that can be downloaded there. Another place is at the website on Uncommon Descent, where I have answer more informally criticisms of my books. And finally, at the Discovery website, where I comment on progress in science throughout, over time. So anybody who wants to know the nitty-gritty can look at these things. Now these are my responses to critics. If you want to read the original criticisms themselves, they're easy to find too. You just go to any search engine, just type in my name plus any common swear word, and and you'll get tons of hits. And thank you very much for your attention.